Hello everyone, welcome to Bajirao IAS Academy, the Hindu news analysis. Today is 15th May 2025 and today we have some very important topics for the discussion. So one by one we'll try to discuss all these important topics in a very detailed manner. And the first topic is about the education system in India and the failure of the education system in India to create gainful employment opportunities. The second article is challenges beyond Pakistan. So India would face challenges beyond Pakistan. India should not confine itself with Pakistan. So there are a number of other issues and other dimensions that India needs to look into. This is also a very important article for your general studies paper 2, and this is an exhaustive and a detailed article that has been given in the Indian Express newspaper. The third article is US-China trade deal and how this trade deal will impact India's trade with both US and China. And we also have one prelims important topic, that is retail inflation in India, and we will also understand the inflation differences like consumer price index or wholesale price index. We'll understand different types of inflation as part of this. So let's proceed on to discuss the first very important topic, that is about in India education without employment, right? So in fact, we have a robust education system, but the education system is largely failed to create gainful employment opportunities in India. So we'll try to understand the reasons why education system is largely failed to create gainful employment opportunities in India. So this article has been given in the Hindu newspaper, and this will be very important for your general studies paper 3 of UPSC. Now the context is that it is being said that in India, we have a national education policy that was launched in the year 2020. So the overall objective of National Education Policy 2020 is to make sure that the learning outcomes should be improved and education should create a knowledge-based society in India or knowledge-based economy in India. So therefore, we have launched National Education Policy in the year 2020, right? So however, Indian education system continues to suffer a number of problems. So what are the problems that the Indian education system has been continuously facing? So one is a low graduate employability. So imagine that if you become a graduate from a particular college, and it is less likely that you would get employment. So therefore, a low graduate employability is main problem that the Indian education system has been facing. Secondly, poor industry linkages. Industry academia linkages are very important, so that the educational institution should understand the requirements of the industries, and accordingly the skilled workforce can be produced by the academia and educational institutions, and that helps in the graduates readily employable. And the third problem is lack of innovation startups. We have already discussed about this. So when we talk about lack of innovation based startups, most of the startups in India are confined to e-commerce or other less tech savvy sectors rather than deep technology involved sectors. So therefore, it also indicates there is a lack of innovation outputs as well. So these are the main problems that the Indian education system has been suffering. However, the critics have been arguing that the education system produces degrees, or the educational institutions, there are number of graduates from these educational institutions, but they have a very little market value. So whatever certificates they have a very less or little market value, and in fact they very often fail to get employment because they fail to meet the evolving demands of the industry, right? Because India is a knowledge-based economy. In knowledge-based economy, it is very important that whoever is graduating from the colleges, they need to meet the evolving demands of the industries. But the problem is that the college graduates are not able to meet the evolving demands of the industry. The reason is poor industry linkages which are existing in India. So I hope you have understood the context of this particular article. Now the systematic flaws in vision and policy execution which are existing. So one by one we'll try to understand what are the systematic flaws which are existing in the implementation of the national education policy and the failure of the education system in creating productive and gainful employment opportunities in India. So in fact, the national education policy 2020 is hailed as a educational renaissance, because it hailed as a educational renaissance because it emphasizing on a number of areas. It emphasizing on gender equality, it emphasizing on learning outcomes, it emphasizing on teacher training, right? So it has been emphasizing on number of areas, and that is why it is said that it is an educational renaissance. However, the national education policy of 2020 clearly appears to ignore a shape-shifting needs of the job market, because we have understood that a job market is continuously evolving and industry requirements also continuously changes. However, the national educational policy failed to recognize this fact. So therefore, it has been leading to a 2025 a graduate employability of only 6%, right? So whoever become graduated in 2025, only 6% get employment, right? So nearly unchanged from 44.3% in 2023. So this has been indicating that the national education policy has actually neglected the need for the evolving demands of the industry, and accordingly the academia need to train the graduates as per the requirements of the industry. So since it has been ignored, a very less number of graduates are readily employed. So this is the first problem. This is the systematic flaw that has been existing. Secondly, despite promising flexibility has been allowed in the national education policy. For example, there are multiple entry and exit points within the national education policy, right? So for example, a candidate who join a college, so there are multiple entry and exit options allowed by the national education policy, right? So we can say that it is flexible. So despite having such a flexibility, it only enabled the low quality e-commerce jobs, right? So in fact, a number of other countries have been working on the deep technologies, but in India, most of these sectors or the startups are located or concentrated in the e-commerce jobs or food delivery platforms. So therefore, it has only enabled the low quality e-commerce jobs without a systematic pedagogical reform or the scaling infrastructure. So this is another major problem that has been existing in the implementation of national education policy. And secondly, there is an absence of industry representation in the policy formulation. It is okay that national education policy 2020 has been framed, right? So it is also said that educational renaissance, but the national education policy clearly appears to neglect, or there are no industry representatives in the policy formulation. So if you wanted that the passed out students to get employment, it is very important that you should also include industry representatives in the formulation of national education policy, so that you can understand the requirements of the industries and accordingly you would train the students, right? So only then they will get readily employable, and it will also result in the education system has been creating gainful employment opportunities for the students. But here the problem is that the committee which has drafted the national education policy clearly lacked any member from the industry or business sector. So that has resulted in policy formulation which is detached from the economic realities and also the larger employment demands, right? So it essentially means that the stakeholder engagement, when you are formulating a policy, you need to include all important stakeholders in the policy formulation, right? So once you engage all different stakeholders in a policy formulation, you will understand what are the areas that have to be focused upon. And in fact, in India, we knew that after 1991 economic reforms, what happened was we directly jumped from the agriculture sector to the service sector. We skipped the manufacturing sector, right? So we skipped the manufacturing or industry after 1991 economic reforms. So that is why India's growth is considered as jobless growth. But it is very important that we need to shift the excess workforce from the agriculture sector to the industry and manufacturing. So for that, when you are framing the national education policy, it is very important that you need to consult or you need to have representatives from the industry. Only then you will understand what are the demands and requirements of the industries, and accordingly you will train the workforce. So these are some systematic flaws which are existing in the vision of national education policy. And in recent times, the educational institutions are also started emphasizing more on research quality, ranking, and accountability. Right? So it is very important that any institution should have, it should emphasize on research quality. Right? So a good quality research. Rankings, it's okay about rankings, because if you improve standards, if you improve teaching, if you improve the research quality, rankings automatically improves, and it will also result in the larger accountability from the institutions. So it is being said that 11 Indian institutions or 11 Indian universities have entered into this QS top 500 India's category. Right? So QS top ranking of all educational institutions across the world. So around 11 Indian universities become part of this list. However, so this Indian category, a normalized citation impact, so that remains poor. Right? So which means that India has still remained poor in certain areas, particularly in these educational institutions. So therefore it reflects there is a low research quality despite increased quantity. Right? So the category called normalized citation impact. So this normalized citation impact category, India still remained poor, and this actually means that India's research quality is not up to the mark. It is substandard, or there is a low research quality which has been existing. So there is a need to emphasize on research quality. Now, when you emphasize on research quality, it also plays a very, very important role in producing the workforce or the graduates who are readily employable, and the graduates who can engage in deep technology startups as well, which could be more and more productive as well. Secondly, there are number of projects which are already launched. For example, project called Imprint and Akash Tablets and Council for Scientific and Industrial Research, NMITLI. So these are number of scientific projects which are already launched in collaboration with various educational institutions. So, but the problem with these projects is that there is a lack of publicly available data on the outcomes. So what are the outcomes from these projects that we have already launched? Right? So if you have the publicly available data on the outcomes of these projects, so you would understand the outcomes, you would understand the results. Right? But the problem is there is a lack of publicly available data on the outcomes of these important projects, and thereby it has been raising significant concerns for value for money and accountability within these institutions. And secondly, in recent times, India has ranked 39 in Global Innovation Index. In Global Innovation Index, India ranked 39 in 2024. However, India is still behind countries like Malaysia, which ranked 33, Turkey, which ranked 37. So therefore, there are existing top innovation clusters in India like Bengaluru, which ranked 56. So they perform far below than the global leaders like Cambridge 1 and Silicon 6. So therefore, it indicating that there is some structural and fundamental problems which are existing, and that is very, very important to improve innovation climate. So it is being said that if you look at Indian startups, most of the Indian startups are engaging in startup e-commerce and also the online food delivery platforms. Right? So most of the Indian startups are concentrated in this. However, startups in countries like China, so they have been engaging deep technology. Right? So they have been engaged in deep technology, but Indian startups are mostly confined to the low technology startup ecosystems. Right? So however, when you focus on quality research, when you focus on improving innovation right from the educational institutions, so that plays a very, very important role in producing a number of entrepreneurs who could engage in the deep technology startups, and that could be a strategic edge for the country as well. Right? And apart from that, there are certain startup illusions and even the structural myopia which is also existing in India, because it is being said that in India we have misunderstood the startup ecosystem. So as I have already emphasized, so how we have misunderstood the existing startup ecosystem in India, because unlike the other country startups or global startups which have been engaging in a deep technology challenges, right? So most of the global startups have been engaged in deep technology challenges, but Indian startups are mostly concentrated or mostly revolving around food delivery platforms, e-commerce, digital marketplaces. So therefore it has been indicating that there is a lack of foundation in indigenous science and technology, right? So on this image you could even see that the most of the Indian startups are concentrated in e-commerce sector, followed by fintech and the consumer services, and so other different things. But it is very important that we need to produce a number of startups which engages in the deep technology challenges like China. And in fact, a higher educational institution regulating agency called University Grants Commission. So in these days, University Grants Commission has been acting as a barrier rather than the facilitator, because University Grants Commission, a statutory body, and it is a regulatory body of higher educational institutions. It should play the role of facilitator, but it has been playing a role of a barrier, right? So because of its role as a barriers, it has been crippling the autonomy of the educational institutions, right? So the freedom and autonomy of the educational institutions. So therefore the UGC actually retains both regulatory and financial control, but UGC largely failed to show any empirical data linking the pedagogy reforms to employability or skilling improvements. So this is also another major problem that has been existing in the higher education system or the overall Indian education system, that clearly fails to create a large scale gainful employment opportunities in India. And in fact, the national education policy claims to offer a flexible curricula, right? So it has provided that flexibility for number of institutions to decide on their curriculum, and curriculum is also flexible for those institutions. However, it neither ensures depth, so that is a technical expertise, it nor ensures the breadth, so that means the interdisciplinary agility of the different subjects. So therefore both technical expertise and the interdisciplinary agility are critical in artificial intelligence driven and constantly evolving job market. So ultimately we could say that there are some structural and fundamental challenges, issues which are existing, and that is the main reason why most of the graduates are not readily employable in Indian economy. So therefore these structural and foundational issues must be resolved, and there should be a strong industry academia linkages. So academia should understand the requirements or demands of the industry, and accordingly the educational institutions can mold the students, can impart skills as well, so that they can get readily employable. Now understand the other thing, that India is a country with a huge demographic dividend in the world, and we need to utilize this demographic dividend to achieve the goal of becoming Vikasit Bharat. So we wanted to become Vikasit Bharat by the year 2047. So if we wanted to become Vikasit Bharat by 2047, we need to use the existing demographic dividend in an appropriate manner, in a productive manner. So if you are not able to create gainful employment opportunities for the college graduates, you cannot expect that this demographic dividend can be effectively utilized. So these are the issues which are existing. So therefore appropriate reforms need to be brought in the education system in general and higher education system in particular, to make sure that the college passed out students are readily gets employed. And next important topic, that the challenges that India would face beyond Pakistan. So we knew that Pakistan is a continuous supporter of cross-border terrorism, and recent Pahalgam attack, Pakistan was responsible for this Pahalgam terror attack where innocent civilians were killed by the terrorists. So after that, as part of India's response, India launched Operation Sindoor, and everybody knows about this. And this has led to a kind of an escalation between India and Pakistan, and ultimately it was resolved as part of ceasefire between these two countries. However, a very important article has been produced in the Indian Express newspaper, and this is very important for your general studies paper too. Now, one thing that we should understand, that India has ambitions to become a larger regional player and also the global player. So in this context, we cannot afford to confine ourselves with Pakistan itself in the region. So therefore, India should look beyond Pakistan, and this is what the author has been emphasizing upon. So going ahead, we'll understand why there is a need for India to look beyond Pakistan, and how we can actually take up different challenges or the opportunities across the world. So the context is that India has a significant confrontation with Pakistan in recent times. So New Delhi must look beyond its western neighbor, right? So we should not confine ourselves with Pakistan alone, rather we should look beyond Pakistan to engage with much more complex and evolving global geopolitical dynamics, right? So it is very important that the geopolitical dynamics have been evolving at a faster pace, and we are living in a multilateral world, not a unilateral or a bilateral world. So therefore, in this context, India must understand the evolving the geopolitical dynamics, which are more and more complex. And in fact, the rise of multipolarity. So what is multipolarity exactly? So multipolarity actually means there are different centers of power across the world, right? So after the Cold War, during the Cold War, it was a bipolar world, USSR and US. So after the fall of Soviet Union, it was a unipolar world order. Now the world appears more like a multipolar world order, because there are multiple centers of power, and there is a rise in multipolarity across the world and great power politics also. And in both great power politics and multipolarity, there are number of countries such as US, China and Russia. So they have been playing a very important role. And after Trump elected for the second time as a president of US, Trump has adopted a transactional diplomacy. And all these things demand a recalibrated Indian foreign policy outlook that looks beyond the Pakistan's challenge. So we should look beyond the Pakistan's challenge, because we need to confront the much more complex and evolving global geopolitical dynamics. So this is what the author has been emphasizing upon. Now we'll understand how the shifting global alignments and power triangles have been shaping the multipolar world order, making it much more complex. So when India and Pakistan were fighting each other during this particular period of time, Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin, so they have reaffirmed their commitment, they have reaffirmed their deepening strategic ties. So already they become much more closer because of this Russia-Ukraine war and Western sanctions on Russia. So in this particular context, both Russia and China, they have come together. However, during India-Pakistan conflict, both Chinese president and also Russian president, so they have reaffirmed a deepening strategic ties between these two countries, and they even called themselves as a friends of steel. So ultimately they are reaffirming, committing themselves to build a post-American order. So this period is called as a period of US decline. So US has been declining, and that is what is called as the post-American order. So therefore both China and US have reaffirmed that they would further strengthen, deepen their strategic ties, and they call themselves as friends of steel, and they also plan to build the post-American order, despite both these countries engaging with the United States differently. So China's engagement with US is different, and Russia's engagement with US is also different. Secondly, US-China trade ceasefire. So we all knew that there was a trade war that was going on between US and China. So both these countries have been imposing reciprocal tariffs on each other as like a tit for tat move. But when India and Pakistan were fighting each other, another significant move was unfolding, that was US-China trade ceasefire. So they were trying to normalize the issues which are surrounding around the trade between US and China. So therefore, while South Asia has been witnessing the military escalation, US and China have negotiated a pause in their trade war, a temporary trade agreement that these two countries have signed, and ultimately it signifies the fluid and the pragmatic nature of the global power engagements. And even these developments actually mark a departure from the ideological camps. So clearly it actually marks a departure from the ideological camps, and it is being said that in 21st century there is no role for the ideology, right? So it is partly true, not completely true, but it is being said that the both China and Russia coming together, US and China coming together, having a temporary trade deal, so it is being said that it is a clear departure from their ideological camps. And in fact, in today's world order, it is largely shaped by a fixed alliances and more transactional multipolar equations, particularly after Donald Trump become US president, where the strategic flexibility matters more than the bloc-based thinking of countries. And that's why it is being said that India should look beyond Pakistan. India should look beyond the region. And recently the other things are also happening or taking place, that Donald Trump is in Middle East, right? So Trump's transactional diplomacy and Gulf outreach, if you can carefully look into it, it is being said that Donald Trump's Middle East visit. So why he is visiting Middle East? What is the significance of Donald Trump's visit to Middle East? So this visit particularly aims to secure over a 2 trillion investments in US. And apart from securing 2 trillion investments, the other aim of Donald Trump's visit to West Asia is to secure an arms deal from Saudi Arabia, UAE and Qatar, so thereby aligning a foreign policy with the domestic economic objectives of US. Firstly, selling arms to countries in the Middle East, and secondly, also attracting larger investments into US from the West Asia. So this is the objective of Trump's visit to the West Asia. And apart from that, Trump also have some personal and familial business interests in the West Asia or Middle East, such as US dollars 5.5 billion Qatari Golf project. So that is being blended or mixed with the statecraft and overall underscoring a thoroughly transactional nature of his diplomacy. So it is being said that Trump's overall diplomacy is more transactional in nature, more transactional in the sense that, so he also made the claims that when he announced ceasefire, it is being said that he appealed to both India and Pakistan that if you guys come to an agreement about this, then we'll deal in terms of trade, right? So there will be more trade concessions like this. However, India categorically refused this. When it comes to discussions or talks on ceasefire, so there was nothing like trade which has came forefront, right? So Trump is purely transactional in nature, and this is also another reason why US and its hegemony has been declining, and why Russia and China are planning to build the post-American world order, or planning to dominate the post-American world order, and they are also coming together. And in fact, so Trump also have plans to deal with Iran as well. So we knew that the relations between US and Iran are not too friendly, right? So they have a conflictual relationship with each other, because Iran acquires plans for so Iran have a plans for acquiring nuclear weapons, and Iran also has a plans for having regional dominance in West Asia. And in fact, there are several countries such as Saudi Arabia, UAE, and different other countries are clear allies of US. However, there is a conflict that has been going on between Iran and Saudi Arabia. So therefore, the relations between Iran and Saudi Arabia are not so good. However, in order to prevent Iran procuring nuclear weapons, US under Barack Obama signed a joint comprehensive plan of action with Iran, along with 5 other Security Council members. Right, so 5 other Security Council members plus Germany. So they have signed a joint comprehensive plan of action with Iran. Now, under this joint comprehensive plan of action, so US will lift sanctions on Iran, and in return, Iran will give up its plans to have or acquire nuclear weapons. So that is joint comprehensive plan of action. So however, when Donald Trump became president for the first time, he withdrew from the joint comprehensive plan of action, and after that the relations between Iran and the US started declining, right? So therefore, this recent visit of Donald Trump to Middle East also being seen as his plans to have an agreement or re-engage with Iran, so that there kind of a regional stability that could be achieved in the Middle East, right? So what will be the implications for India's foreign policy beyond? So we'll understand the implications for foreign policy. So if India looks beyond Pakistan, beyond the South Asia, so while India must reinforce red lines, because Pakistan is continuously supporting the cross-border terrorism, so therefore it is very important that there should be clear red lines for the Pakistan when it comes to its support to the cross-border terrorism. But India should not, or India must not be consumed by this binary with respect to Pakistan, because as of now the world is moving in a multiple directions simultaneously, and India should not miss this opportunity. There are a number of opportunities waiting for India. So therefore, India should not miss this opportunity where the world is moving at a faster pace, and India should not confine itself to Pakistan alone while setting certain red lines for Pakistan for its continuous support to cross-border terrorism is very important. Secondly, so India requires strategic maturity. So when I say strategic maturity, the oversimplified lens of friends versus enemies, or friends versus foes, so this is inadequate in a in a multilateral world, right? So India must enhance its understanding of the triangular and multipolar power plays. So how power plays, how multilateral world system works, and India should also invest in domain expertise and even negotiation capacities as well. And apart from that, so India should also invest more and more on its diplomacy as well. So India should improve the complex bargaining and also shifting alliances. So in this context, in this particular context, that is complex bargaining and shifting alliances all across the world, undermining India's professional diplomatic corps would be self-defeating for India. So therefore, India needs a skilled diplomats to pursue the strategic autonomy and also the global relevance. So we very often heard about the strategic autonomy as a term. What does it mean? What does the strategic autonomy actually means? Now, strategic autonomy actually means that it refers to a nation's ability to make independent decisions, independent choices in its foreign policy and the defense policies. So without being overly influenced by the external powers, right? So India can be able to take its decisions on its own without being influenced by the external powers, and that is what is called as the strategic autonomy. And in fact, despite Western pressure during Russia-Ukraine war, India continues to purchased oil from Russia. So this is the example of the strategic autonomy. And the next very important topic is US-China trade deal. So in the backdrop of reciprocal tariffs between US and China, So they have imposed tariffs on one another. In this backdrop, so they have signed a temporary trade deal with each other. So in this context, we'll understand what is the significance of this US-China trade deal for India. What will be the implications of this trade deal for India? The context is that a temporary trade deal that has been signed by both US and China, and these two countries are world's largest economies. So US is world's largest economy and China is the second largest economy, and India is the fifth largest economy in terms of GDP. So where both China and US agreed to scale back on tariffs significantly for 90 days. So this temporary trade agreement will work for 90 days, and in these 90 days, so they will discuss a more practicable, more plausible trade agreement within these 90 days, but they have decided to significantly scale back the tariffs that they have imposed previously. And therefore, this actually marks a significant pause in the otherwise escalating global trade tensions. And in fact, if you look at the total bilateral trade between US and China, so in the year 2023, the bilateral trade between US and China is 595.83 billion. So this is the total bilateral trade. However, so US-China bilateral trade is 5 times more than US and India bilateral trade. So US and India bilateral trade stands around 112 billion US dollars or something, but when you compare India US bilateral trade, so with China US bilateral trade, it is 595. So it's actually huge, right? So that's why it is very, very important to understand the US and China bilateral trade and its implications on India. Now, what are the key features of US-China trade agreement? So if you look at the key features of trade agreement, so US has decided to reduce average tariff on Chinese goods from 145%. So its maximum tariffs that were imposed by US on Chinese goods in April was 125. Now US has decided 145. US now decided to reduce this tariffs from 145 to 30% for a 90-day period, while China reduced tariffs on imports from 125% to 10%, right? So US reduced tariffs to 30% and China reduced tariffs to 10%. So after this temporary bilateral trade agreement between US and China, global stock markets rallied around 2% to 3.8%. So there is a significant rise in global stock markets after this trade deal has been signed, because it sends a positive signals for the investors, and that's why they started investing in the stock markets, and that has led to a continuous rally of the stock markets from 2.2% to 3.8%, right? So it indicates the investor optimism over the easing trade tensions between both the economic giants, because US the first largest economy and China is the second largest economy. So what was the context of this trade war prior to this, right? So if you look into the context of trade war between US and China, the agreement was followed by months of escalating tariffs, and we would also call it a trade war or a reciprocal tariffs with on each other. So including President Trump's February 1st move for variable tariffs and selective April pause that excluded China, and that further worsened the bilateral strains, right? So however, the strategic interpretation of US actions. So how can we strategically look at the US actions when it comes to the temporary trade deal that it has signed with China? So the trade deal may reflect Trump's recognition of China's importance, because understand the bilateral trade is around 595 billion US dollars. So therefore, China is very, very important economic partner for US. So this particular temporary trade deal is essentially recognition of China's importance into the US economy. So therefore, it indicates a softening of his aggressive stance on China, firstly. Secondly, It may indicate Trump's high pressure tariff strategy has actually succeeded, because China has also agreed to come to terms with US, and China also signed this temporary free trade agreement. Remember that China has reduced tariffs to 10% while US has reduced tariffs to 30%. So therefore it has indicating that Trump's high pressure tariff strategy may have succeeded. However, despite a temporary trade deal that has been signed between China and US, there are a number of issues which are not yet resolved. For example, the US a trade deficit with China. So US has a huge trade deficit with China, how India has a trade deficit with China. However, Trump's central concern remains untouched. However, while signing a temporary free trade agreement between these two countries, so they gradually start discussing about number of other areas where they have a mutual concern, or they have a concern. So those issues will be gradually taken up, right? Because this temporary trade deal is for 90 days that they have signed up. Now what will be the implications for India after signing this agreement? So it will certainly challenge China plus one strategy. So what is this China plus one strategy? Now after the COVID-19 pandemic, most of the countries and even private companies had adopted China plus one strategy. So earlier, most of the companies have their manufacturing bases in China because of the availability of skilled labor and low manufacturing costs. Most of the manufacturing companies of the Western countries are located in China. But after the COVID-19 pandemic and even rise in labor costs in China and number of other factors, what has been happened was the private companies have been looking for the alternatives to shift their manufacturing bases out of China. So this is China plus one strategy. However, so this temporary trade deal between US and China will hurt the China plus one strategy. And in fact, India also expected that whatever manufacturing bases which are shifting out of China, they will establish their manufacturing bases in India, because India is also a country which is having a huge workforce, right? So cheap workforce or cheap labor force, land availability, and stable government also. So therefore it is expected that US China trade deal, if US-China relations improve, China remains its competitive advantage in the global manufacturing. So already China dominates the global manufacturing. Chinese economy is run by the export of its products across the world. So therefore, if US-China relations further improve, it will sideline India's incomplete leverage of China plus one model. Secondly, India has formally notified WTO of its reciprocal tariffs on US steel and aluminium, right? So this is also part of the reciprocal tariffs that US and India have imposed on each other, right? So now India decided to formally notify WTO's reciprocal tariffs on US steel and aluminium. Therefore, it has been highlighting the fragile nature of current US and China trade talks or trade relations. So apart from that, there are certain structural hindrances which are also existing, such as, so India is having a huge trade deficit with China. So as of now, in the financial year 24, India has a trade deficit of $85 billion. The total bilateral trade between India and China in the financial year 24 is 18.4 billion US dollars. China exports 101 billion worth of goods to India, but India exports just $16.7 billion worth of goods to China, and that leads to a huge trade deficit between India and China. So therefore, there are certain structural issues which are existing. One is a huge trade deficit with China, so that is being coupled with weak land and labor reforms in India. So overall, it will impact the ability to scale the cost-effective domestic manufacturing and also attract the foreign investors into India. So these are the key implications of the temporary trade agreement that has been signed between US and China. And next very important topic is retail inflation has come down. right? So this is very important for your prelims examination. The context is that India's retail inflation has recently hit a 59-month low. So it has came down from 3.54% in July 2024. And the significant decrease comes after a high inflation rate that was registered in 7.44% in July 2023, from 7.44% to 3.354%. Right? So there's a significant decline in the retail inflation in India. However, the decline in inflation is largely because of a high base effect. So we'll understand what is this high base effect, because this is also very, very important, right? So the decline in inflation is largely because of the high base effect from the previous year, so which has also led to a drop in the food inflation, right? So in fact, what is this high base effect? Right, so high base effect essentially means that a significant drop in inflation is partly due to comparing the current prices with the high prices in the previous year or last year. So that is what is called as the base effect. So you have to compare the current prices with the higher prices which were existing in the previous year, and that is what is called as the base effect. And in fact, a core inflation, right? So what is the core inflation? So core inflation actually excludes the volatile items. There are certain items which are considered as volatile items. For example, food and fuel. These are volatile items. So the core inflation rose to 3.4% after excluding both food and fuel in July due to the higher gold prices and also the telecom tariff increases. Now, what is this consumer price index? So consumer price index is a metric that is used for measuring inflation in India. It measures changes over a time in general level of prices of goods and services. Remember, the consumer price index includes both goods and services, but wholesale price index include only the goods, right? The change in the price index over period of time is referred to as consumer price index based inflation or retail inflation. So we have just understood what exactly is a base effect. So based on this understanding, kindly answer this question and type the correct answer in the comment section. So a clear difference between consumer price index and a wholesale price index has been given. So if you look at the definition of wholesale price index, it amounts to the average change in the prices of commodities at the wholesale level, right? So at the wholesale level, so the average change in the prices of commodities, but the consumer price index, it indicates the average change in the prices of commodities at the retail level. So the difference is wholesale level and retail level. See, the wholesale price index is published by the Office of Economic Advisor, Ministry of Commerce and Industry, right? So Ministry of Commerce and Industry, Office of Economic Advisor issues wholesale price index, but the consumer price index is published by National Statistical Office, right? So NSO publishes the consumer price index. And in fact, wholesale price index includes only goods, but consumer price index includes both goods and services, right? So inflation measurement, wholesale price index, first stage of a transaction, consumer price index, the final stage of transaction. And prices are being paid by manufacturers and wholesalers in the wholesale price index, and consumer price index, prices are paid by the consumers. And base year for wholesale price index 2011-12, and consumer price index, it is 2012. And wholesale price index include manufacturing inputs, intermediate goods, minerals, machineries, basic metals. However, consumer price index include both goods and services such as education, communication, transportation, recreation, food, beverages, all these different things. So the difference between the consumer price index and wholesale price index is very, very important for your prelims examination. Please kindly go through this. So that's all in this lecture. Kindly answer that question that I have given to you, and if you have any other doubts, please type those doubts in the comment section. We'll try to address those doubts as well. So thank you.